Yeah, I'm honored to be amongst people that I've been reading for the last year or so to compile this research. And just so that I don't look like I'm about to do some work with a chainsaw, I'm going to take off this headset. One sec. So hi, everybody. My name is Jorden Conrad, and I am a researcher affiliated with St. Mary's University. I am one of the authors of this study in which I'm about to present, called An Honest Dilemma, Exploring Relationships Between Empathy, Personality, and Prosocial Lying. Along with myself, Dr. Meg Ternes of St. Mary's University is both an author and supervisor to this study. Honesty is considered a highly valued trait within our society. The act of being dishonest is known to lead to a social ostracization among peers. But are all types of lying associated with negative traits? And contrary to this, an example of lying that may be associated with positive traits is prosocial lying. Prosocial lying happens when a lie is told to prevent another person from physical or emotional harm. There's evidence within the literature suggesting that compassion increases and predicts prosocial lying in adults. 4 out of 5 empathy studies found that empathy increases prosocial lying. Specifically, cognitive empathy and perspective taking increases prosocial lying. With regards to personality, research shows that self-esteem predicts prosocial lying. Also, positive associations with prosocial lying include emotionality, honesty, humility, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. In this study, the relationship between empathy, personality, and prosocial lying was explored to see if our findings would be consistent with the current literature. In order to address possible gaps in the literature, we decided to use scales of measurement that hadn't been previously analyzed in other studies on prosocial lying. And the aim of this research is to expand on our understanding of prosocial lying and help determine whether positive interpersonal traits can influence its prevalence. So our hypotheses were prosocial lying has a positive relationship with empathy, prosocial lying has a positive relationship with perspective taking, and prosocial lying has a positive relationship with agreeableness. Participants were recruited from the recruitment platform Sona, as well as Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. The majority of our participants were between the ages of 18 and 32, and they were female and white. The scales that were used for this study were the Lying in Everyday Situation Scale, the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and the HEXCO PIR. The Lying in Everyday Situation Scale is a self-report questionnaire designed to measure the general attitude towards various lying behavior. The different types of lying measured in the scale is self-serving, vindictive, and prosocial lying, and we are referring to it as prosocial lying, even though it's listed as altruistic, because within the majority of the literature used, prosocial lying and altruistic lying is used often interchangeably, and most of the data that we based our hypotheses off of use the term prosocial lying. To measure empathy, we use the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, which consists of 4 different components of empathy, which were perspective taking, fantasy, empathic concern, and personal distress. The final scale that we used was the HEXCO PIR, and it measures 6 different personality traits: honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. For our data analysis, we ran a series of bivariate correlations to assess relationships between different components of empathy, personality traits, and different types of lying. Then, if a correlation was found, we would run a simple linear regression analysis to determine whether that component of empathy or personality trait was an independent predictor of prosocial lying. So in order to test our first hypothesis, we ran a bivariate correlation on empathy and prosocial lying. We found that empathy was positively correlated with prosocial lying, which was consistent with our hypothesis and the current psychological literature. We then ran a simple linear regression and determined that empathy was an independent positive predictor of prosocial lying. When we looked at the correlations between prosocial lying and specific components of empathy, our analysis was congruent with our second hypothesis, in which perspective taking was positively associated with prosocial lying. In fact, all but one, personal distress, had a positive relationship with prosocial lying. We also found that fantasy, empathic concern, and perspective taking were all positive predictors of prosocial lying. When we analyzed personality traits, we found that contrary to our third hypothesis, agreeableness was not associated with prosocial lying. This finding was not consistent with the literature. However, we did find that emotionality was positively associated with prosocial lying, which is consistent with the literature, while not being one of our hypotheses. We also, thankfully, found that honesty, humility was negatively associated with prosocial lying, so that makes sense. When we ran some regressions on them, we found that emotionality was an independent positive predictor of prosocial lying, and honesty, humility was an independent negative predictor of prosocial lying. And just so that the other types of lying motivations didn't feel left out, we ran some correlational analyses on self-serving and vindictive lying. First, we found that empathy was negatively associated with vindictive lying. We then ran a simple linear regression and found that empathy was an independent negative predictor of vindictive lying. Components of empathy that were negatively associated with empathic concern components of empathy that were negatively associated with were empathic concern and perspective taking. Both empathic concern and perspective taking were independent positive predictors of prosocial lying. Vindictive lying was also negatively associated with honesty, humility, agreeableness, and openness to experience. And honesty, humility, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Honesty, humility, agreeableness, and openness to experience were all independent negative predictors of vindictive lying. Honesty, humility, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness were negatively associated with lying of the self-serving variety, and they were also all independent negative predictors of self-serving lying. So the first strength of this study was that data collection was completely anonymous. Hopefully this negated some of the impression bias that participants may have felt when answering a questionnaire about ability to empathize, deep-rooted personal attitudes, and lying habits. Another strength was that the wide age range could allow our data to be generalized to a broader demographic. Also, when considering impression management with regards to lying, we included a small statement that endorsed that lying was common and normal to do. One of the study's weaknesses is that it only involves self-report questionnaires. This means that participants' response may not have been solely based on their actual behavior or beliefs. For example, impression management for the act of concealing or exaggerating a true response could be prevalent throughout our study. If the participant isn't engaging in impression management, they may also be responding to statements carelessly, or unintended interpretation could influence an otherwise honest response. Also, the lie statements that were mentioned earlier as a strength may potentially have repercussions to participants' responses. The normalizing statements may have accidentally manipulated the participants into exaggerating their responses instead of encouraging honesty. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, the study was only able to involve a self-report questionnaire. In the future, we would like to contribute more to already existing research on empathy and prosocial lying by conducting a study using a more experimental approach. Following the footsteps of already existing experiments, we could do this by comparing two groups of participants' results in a game. The game would involve some sort of deception in which participants would decide if a Confederate should earn points, regardless of if the Confederate actually earned the points or not. Therefore, the participant would have to lie for the sake of the other in order for the Confederate to earn enough points and potentially win. One group of participants would be primed to experience empathy towards a Confederate researcher, potentially through a related backstory of the Confederate, while the other would not, which would be the neutral condition. So this would enable us to look at whether feeling empathy towards someone could lead to prosocial lying, as our research suggests that it does. Thank you.